Welcome to Better Than Before. This series is a collaboration with CANARI, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, with funding from the Open Society Foundations. We are exploring how to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, supporting the Caribbean's transition to socially inclusive, climate resilient, and environmentally sustainable development. I am your host, Durval Bazi, founder of the Climate Conscious podcast. Today's special guest is an Antiguan environmentalist, presently serving as the executive director of the Environmental Awareness Group in her home country. A recipient of an Australian Leadership Award, she holds a master's in environmental management, sustainable development, and later went on to complete a fellowship at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She has been working in the environmental field for more than a decade and championed the plastic bag ban in Antigua and Barbuda. Her work presently focuses on providing people and communities with the resources they need so that conservation action can be locally led. She believes strongly that real change comes through communication and desires to see not just the sustainable use of natural resources, but an appreciation for them as well. Welcome to the podcast, Arica Hill.
Thank you so much, Derval.
Thanks for joining me, Arica, to talk about the low carbon transition and building resilience for sustainable development in the Caribbean. So, the Caribbean region is characterized as being small island developing states, including the coastal low-lying areas such as Guyana. The region has been facing the triple threats of climate change, biodiversity decline, and inequality. CANARI, in its policy brief, highlighted the long-standing issues of degradation of ecosystems and environmental quality due to pollution and waste, unsustainable extraction, invasive species, and inappropriate physical development. So essentially, all development is not good development. So, Arica, I'd love to hear from you. What does sustainable development in the Caribbean mean to you?
So, I like to think about sustainable development from a very Caribbean standpoint and the standpoint of how it should be very reflective of who I am as a person and who I am as an Antiguan and Barbudan. So when I think about sustainable development, I think about it as, creating pathways for incorporating our culture and traditions and making sure that those things are incorporated into all facets of society. I think about it as being responsive to people and the environment. And so not ignoring, who we are as people, but also not ignoring the specialness of our natural resources. And because it understands the specialness of our natural resources, it means that we respect it a lot and we design it to make sure that it is for us and therefore by us and representative of us. So for me, especially as an environmentalist, I wanted to include my critically endangered species like the Antiguan racer or the Barbuda warbler. I want it to feel like all the things that make up us, so parts of our carnival and our music. And I know that that doesn't normally sound like what sustainable development is kind of purported to be within the Caribbean, but I feel like if our development does not feel like us, it does not look like us, it doesn't sound like us, is it sustainable? Because who is going to be at the forefront of ensuring that it continues and that it continues down a pathway that benefits many people? So I think that's a very big nutshell about what I think about sustainable development, but essentially it really has to be very reflective of who we are as people.
Well, Arica, I have to thank you for that radical definition of sustainable development, which I stand 100% behind. on this podcast, I always emphasize that, who better to protect us? Who better to seek our interests? And
Hmm.
instead of adopting wholesale a model of development that may work perfectly somewhere else, I think that we have enough capacity to come up with a framework that really serves us.
Yes, I agree. Especially because I think, I mean, how everybody else has developed has been based on who they are. And so we keep taking often a very Eurocentric or Western view of how development should look, when the truth is that they have modeled it based on their own needs and based on their own cultures. And if we want something that we can continue, because the whole idea about development is that that sustainable part of it is the part that really is the aspect that we sometimes ignore. If it is not reflective of me, it's very difficult for me to sustain it because I have no connection to it.
Absolutely. So let's hear a bit about your work with Environmental Awareness Group.
Great. So I love talking about the EAG. Our organization has been around for just over 30 years. We are Antigua and Barbuda's longest standing environmental NGO. And our focus has always been on conservation and how do we make sure that we what you call rewild spaces. So we remove invasive alien species from offshore islands. As a result of that work, what we've done is that we've brought our critically endangered endemic Antiguan racer, which is a snake, can be found only on four of our offshore islands. We've brought it from the brink of extinction. We have been able to ensure the protection of other critically endangered endemic species on very remote islands. And the reason that we do this, one reason is that wildlife matters and wildlife does have intrinsic value that has nothing to do with tourism, has nothing to do with what you see and how you enjoy it. It has value in itself, but also because wildlife does have extrinsic value in the sense that it does bring us benefits as well. When you have thriving ecosystems, you have a really strong tourism product, you have a strong ability to be resilient to any climate shocks. You have food security, you have mental health opportunities, you have exercise, you have everything once you have very well functioning ecosystems. So our work is very much focused on that. And because we do things for the benefit of people and wildlife, what we try to do is make sure that we have lots of volunteers. So we train people and we take them out, they learn about how to manage and control invasive alien species. They learn how to monitor wildlife. So not just snakes, but also birds and lizards. They learn how to monitor sea turtles as well, endangered sea turtles that come and nest on our beaches. So we kind of range from many different things. And in all of those things, we're also looking at how do we manage those spaces very well? How do we make sure that there is not just ecological benefit, but economic benefits as well?
And I think it's amazing the work that you all did in terms of bringing back the Antiguan racer from the brink of, is it extinction or endangerment?
Yes, extinction. So they were actually, when we started our work in 1995, there were only 50 individuals in the world. And right now we have just a bit over 1,000, and we're hoping to see, you know, if we can increase the population a bit more. So more work in that area in the next year.
Oh, yes, the work never ends.
Never.
So we're here to reflect on post-COVID recovery and building back better. And one thing about the pandemic is that it definitely amplified the existing challenges and inequalities that the region faces. It's essentially the multiplier effect of the pandemic, right? So it's not just a health crisis, it has such a significant impact on livelihoods and well-being. So from the perspective of environmental sustainability and resilience and your work in conservation, In what ways did COVID-19 affect sustainable development in the Caribbean?
So I think that what it kind of did is it gave us the benefit of a keener focus on how we have to develop. And I think, you know, especially for Antigua, I can speak about how we felt there was like tourism closed down. There was suddenly this reliance on agriculture that wasn't there before. And the feeling also of people wanting to experience the natural environment in a different way. Especially because you're now cooped up in your house, you suddenly recognize, oh, you know, being outside actually does matter. Being in nature does matter. And I think when you, as a collective, because we have seen that importance of the management of our natural resources, I am hoping, and I say I'm hoping as opposed to what I see happening as yet, I'm hoping that it then reshapes how we even plan our policies and how we engage with one another. So you mentioned, like, for instance, the inequalities that we've seen in society. Before, I felt like there wasn't a keen focus on making sure that I heard everybody's voice, or rather, government's focus was not on hearing everyone's voice. I don't think that they can return now to a point of just ignoring people. I think it has to be that not only is civil society going to be a part of decision making, but there has to be like more opportunity for that transparency and that opportunity to just talk to each other so that we can develop better. And I spoke a little earlier about how sustainable development must be representative. The only way that it can be representative of us is if we actually talk to each other. Because I'm working in my silo in environmental management, and even in my area of environmental management is very different to some areas of environmental management, being conservation and dealing with wildlife. So animals is very different to somebody who's planting trees, and how we design our programs and how we design access to green jobs and access to finance and access to these spaces is going to be different, but it has to be that we've spoken to each other to incorporate those things into our programs. So I'm hoping, and I can only hope, that our governments and our civil societies as well have also recognized that we can't do it without each other. And that if we want to make sure that the next pandemic doesn't floor us, that the only way that we can do that is if we are actually working in tandem. And that's difficult, Deval, because our priorities are different. And I mean, I even think about the fact that, I mean, as an environmentalist, I would love for when government is prioritizing development in the year and they have their budget speech in January and they're talking about, well, we're going to put down 10 new hotels. I want to be a part of that conversation. I don't want to find out about it in a budget speech. I want you to say it to me as somebody who is ensuring the survival of species that can be found nowhere else in the world. What do you think? And make it a part of your programs. As how else can we develop, how else can we be certain that we are resilient if we don't support each other? And I am just hopeful, Deval.
Yes, we definitely have to keep hope alive. And I understand your apprehension, because during the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about the new normal. A lot of us, we just wanted to go back to normal, right?
Yes.
But the world has changed, and it definitely requires new ways of doing things, new mindsets, new outlooks, new frameworks. And in line with that, CANARI has developed an analytical framework to assess COVID-19 recovery responses in the Caribbean. And this focuses on four broad principles: transforming economic governance, supporting environmental sustainability while managing trade offs, supporting fairness, inclusion, and justice in economic development, and enabling a low carbon transition and building resilience to address multiple risks. So, in terms of that last pillar of the framework, could you share with us your thoughts on why it's important for us to prioritize low carbon, climate resilient, and environmentally sustainable development for the Caribbean?
When we think about low carbon, and I think very often we throw around the term low carbon without having a real fair and honest conversation about what that means within the Caribbean context based on our scarce resources. And scarce resources does not only mean money, it also means what we really have at hand, the cost of bringing things in, the cost of managing um, what we have and who we have, and the fact that, like, Antigua and Barbuda, 100,000 people. It's a tiny population on two very tiny islands. And I went over to my sister island, Barbuda, the other day, and we keep talking about how Barbuda is going to become this low carbon, carbon neutral island and all of that. And I thought, but how? To get to Barbuda, it is difficult. It's either a plane ride, a helicopter ride, or a boat ride. The cost of anything being carried then on either of these three vessels means that the cost that would have been in Antigua is higher in Barbuda, simply by virtue of the fact that it has to be shipped over to you a second time. When we think about low carbon for the Caribbean, we need for it to be just. It needs to be reflective of our own priorities and what is realistic within our own systems. And so it cannot be based on a Eurocentric or Western requirement for low carbon. It needs to be representative of who we are and what we have in our hands. So that's one part of it. I think it's important, but I think that it needs to be discussed with caution and without being too hasty to kind of paint a brush of what low carbon can really be. And then even when you think about climate resilience, I constantly recognize that whenever we speak about climate resilience, we're always speaking about renewable energy. We're speaking about putting up wind turbines and solar panels, and we're hardly ever speaking about ecosystem-based resilience. We're not thinking about how we're ensuring, and if we do think about ecosystem-based resilience, we are speaking about mangroves only. We're not thinking about our whole scale ecosystems and how we're making sure that our grasslands, our mangrove ecosystems as a full wetland ecosystem is managed well, how our coral reef ecosystems are managed, our offshore island ecosystems, how all of these things are being managed and engineered in such a way that it ensures that we aren't at risk for every climate disaster. And while I understand our crisis and I understand where we are from a sustainable development perspective, I understand that we have to build in those things and recognize that biodiversity loss is happening so quickly around us that if we do not address it as an urgent matter, our climate resilience, quote unquote, as it is purported by developed countries, it won't matter. We will have a storm wash away our wind turbines and our solar panels. It will happen because we haven't built our resilience into our ecosystems. And then from an environmental sustainable development side of things, it again has to be driven by strong policies. And these policies have to, again, incorporate our traditional knowledge, as people, things that we know from hundreds of years of living on this land and understanding how it operates and how it moves. But it also needs to be based on science. So it means we have to collect data. We have to be more focused on collecting data. And it doesn't have to be difficult. EAG as an organization, we really focus a lot on community science and training people to be scientists. Go out in the field and tell me what you see. Observational data is important, but collect that data so that it then feeds into policy. Because if we depend upon policies that are following a political 5-year cycle, it's not going to work. None of this is going to matter. And the crisis that we're in, that we are at the very forefront of, will continue to batter us because we are not putting things in place. Now, with all of that, I kind of think about the fact that it is possible for, especially because we are very dependent on international funding to support us, that we kind of go, well, this is what they're going to fund, so we're going to develop projects and programs that reflect what people say that we need. If you know what you need, you can tell people and tell these international agencies that is not what I need. I need these 5 things, and I need you to support those things. And if those international agencies don't support you, go find somebody else. We need to be very strategic with how we develop, and we have to do this with our modalities, our very real realities at the forefront, as opposed to just taking wholesale what is given to us from the developed world.
So, in your experience, how can the region leverage the COVID-19 recovery for just and climate resilient development in the Caribbean?
So I think what has been obviously a very strong theme throughout what I've been saying today has been, that need for for us to have collectivism. We need to be able to have conversations with one another. And I think there is also a thing that we didn't realize. I don't know if we didn't realize it. I don't know if we knew how powerful we were before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, if we recognized like how much ingenuity goes into how we operate as people. And I can give the example of the EAG and how we have switched things a bit in some cases where, before we used to take children out to on boats to our offshore islands, and it's a huge part of our program. Like we want children to see upside down jellyfish and look through binoculars and see red-billed tropic birds for the first time, and maybe touch an Antiguan racer snake for the first time and have that kind of experience. And obviously, during pandemic, you can't carry out nobody. You are very much bound to mainland Antigua. So we switched up things and we developed a whole virtual classroom experience. And we developed teachers' resource books. We developed student activity booklets. And now the Ministry of Education is saying, well, what is in those teachers' resource books is what's coming up on the exam, the grade 6 exam, because we recognize what you have put into it is nationally important. Now, maybe that would not have happened without a pandemic. As a people, we also need to identify the areas where we found our strength during the pandemic. Did we find that now we needed to think about how we incorporate people with disabilities into our planning a bit better? Did we now think about the fact that, yes, Zoom is a great platform, but everybody doesn't have data? And so now you're realizing I have to be more inclusive in how I plan my things and plan my events. If you've recognized those gaps from your organizational standpoint, and I'm sure we all have you then put those policies in place to make sure that those inequalities, those inaccessibilities are now managed very well. If my organization as a small organization can recognize these things, and other civil society organizations can recognize those things, I'm assuming that governments as well must also recognize these things and therefore build a better program, build systems in place and mechanisms that can support the work that is needed. I think so. That's the one thing, this kind of like just identifying those gaps, but not just identifying the gaps, because a lot of times I find we like to talk about the gaps and then move on. Like if that no, like, yeah, wow, we really are poor. Well, moving on. Like there's no response to it, right? Is it now that we are saying, yes, I recognize these gaps and I'm going to build frameworks, I'm going to build mechanisms. They don't have to be earth shaking, they don't have to cost the world, but they have to be built into your system and communicated well to all stakeholders so that there is that just and climate resilient transition for the Caribbean. If we are mindful in how we develop, if we are mindful based on the lessons that we have learned from COVID, we can really build something that is beautiful and long lasting. But we have to take the time to think it through and not just think it through, but put the mechanisms in place. It's not that hard. But Deval, if you don't ask people how to do it with them, you're also going to end up in the same situation you were before. So, yeah.
Completely agree with you. We definitely have the golden opportunity to, as you said, build something beautiful, but we have to take the time to do the work. So, Arica, based on what you shared, what is your biggest takeaway from the COVID-19 pandemic?
What's very interesting, I think, about how I've been feeling about it is that, and it's something that as an organization that we have taken on as our mantra, that we have a discipline of hope. Everything during the pandemic was a real dumpster fire. It was bad. But in the midst of all of the people losing their jobs, government shutting down, things shutting down, the complete anxiety and distress that was the pandemic. What we saw in the middle of all of that was that we got our volunteer numbers were very low before the pandemic. When we put out a call for people to come and just look at birds, we had 40 people sign up and get trained in how to look at birds. They're now a small bird club called the Wadatli Warblers. In the middle of, you know, seeing that your organization is threatened by this massive external force that you couldn't plan for, we then finally had the time to sit down and do our strategic plan and really take the time to be really intentional about our programs and where we wanted to go in the next 5 years. During that time, because we now had more free time, our team was out on the ocean every few days, just exploring, snorkeling, enjoying nature, and becoming more in tune with the work that we so encourage people to be a part of. What the pandemic has done for us was it reminded us that in the midst of terrible things, there is still beauty. And it is a thing that I personally hold on to very strongly, even in the midst of our climate crisis and the climate anxiety that goes along with it. We will not solve every problem. When we look at even COP27 and there's that beautiful warm glow of finally having loss and damage as a part of our text and seeing that environmental rights are now a part of international text as well. Yeah, I celebrate that. And then somebody said to me, but there's not enough work being done on the fossil fuel emissions and how we manage that. Yeah, there is that. But I'm going to celebrate and dance in the streets for loss and damage being in that text. I think that what the pandemic has taught me and has taught, and it needs to teach us, is that while we do not have the solutions for everything and everything will not be perfect, we can find the beauty, we can celebrate the great wins, and we keep fighting for the things that need to be fixed.
Well said, Arica. There's so much I want to say, but definitely that point about the discipline of hope, I think it's
Mhm.
a perfect summation of the Caribbean spirit.
Yes.
I think our beauty can be seen, especially in our resilience. And
Hmm.
that allows countries like, Antigua, Dominica, the Bahamas to rebuild after such devastating impacts, and that makes me proud to be Caribbean. That rekindles my faith in our ability to really come together and address the issues that are before us. Because at the end of the day, no one is coming to save us, right?
We have to save ourselves.
We certainly do. As we focus on accelerating the transition to green, inclusive, and climate resilient economic development in the Caribbean region, what's one recommendation you would like to see implemented?
So I like to make recommendations based on what I've done myself. So I know it can work, right? Um, in the midst of the pandemic, one of the things that we as EAG recognized was that civil society in Antigua and Barbuda, we're all working very hard at environmental issues, but we're not working together. Our whole, everybody's going after the grant funding, everybody's kind of trying to do their own little thing in their own little corner. And because we're working in silos, it means that we're not sharing resources and not just money. We're not sharing knowledge. We're not sharing skills. We're not sharing, um, I guess it's mostly skills. We're not sharing those things. And so because of that, it means that we're not able to reach our full potential as a civil society. So what we did was we said, okay, well, let's stop that. Let's just stop that. Let's get together. We're going to have our very first environmental EAG environmental conference, which we call ECO. We had it in 2022 in January. And what we did is we brought all of these CSOs together and we all spoke about what work are we doing? How can we support each other? We spoke about how our work interrelates with multilateral environmental agreements that our government has signed. What impact are you really having, not just on a national level, but on an international level as well? And how can we ensure that we keep those lines of communication open, and how can we really push through with advocacy as well? And so we're doing it again. We're going to be working on that, finding new pathways to talk about how do we better manage community science and how do we ensure that as civil society organizations that we are actually making environmental impact. So we're not just planting trees for the sake of it, but we're actually planting the right tree in the right place. And that as a result, we're seeing the reduction of biodiversity loss. All of that to say, when we do get together, when we meaningfully engage with one another and particularly with civil society. And the reason why I say particularly civil society is government's focus is on policy. Government's focus cannot be on implementation. You write the policy and we implement as civil society, right? if you have meaningful engagement with civil society, between civil society, policymakers, so meaning not just your government, your technical officers, but the minister responsible for environment, the minister responsible for fisheries and sustainable development and lands. If you have an engagement between those three sets of people, there is absolutely nothing that we cannot do. For us to move forward, we need to literally put aside old modalities that did not serve us and acknowledge that there is space, that there is room for all of us to have input. And if we do it together, there's so much benefit that we can find. And one benefit that I saw this year was after we had our conference, we then said to several community groups, look, we'll train you in proposal writing. Derval, I only plan to train 3 community groups. 1, 2, 3. I trained 13. And the reason I trained 13 was because there was an avenue for them to be trained. If you open the door for people to engage, they will flood you. Just open the door and do it from now.
Thank you, Arica, for that very insightful discussion on this issue of sustainable development.
I always want to be very thankful to you for, having this conversation with me. And I want to encourage people to have a discipline of hope, to be open to the goodness that surrounds us, and to also just acknowledge what is in your hand and what you have access to, and use that to benefit your community, benefit wildlife. If you're able to just do one thing, and if your one thing could be huge, right? There's some people that their one thing is going to be, doing the litter picking. That's fine. If your one thing is that you're gonna talk every single time that you can about how people need to better engage with environmental policy, then do that. Whatever it is, do it with singular focus, because that is how we make sure that our development is reflective of us and reflective of the things that we require. I also, of course, want to encourage people to follow the EAG at on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Twitter at EAG Antigua. We are very active. There's lots that's going on. If you want to be a member or you want to just donate to our cause, because we are a non-governmental organization, I do encourage you to do so. Your contributions go directly into continued conservation action that is very much locally led, very much looking like Antiguans, sounding like Antiguans, and being for Antiguans and Barbadians. So follow us and support us as much as you can.
As I said, it's so important for us to have these conversations, to have open, inclusive dialogue around sustainable development. And as you said, not just the discipline of hope, but also the bias for action.
Yes.
Thank you so much for listening to the Better Than Before series. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. For more info, or if you'd like to share your questions and ideas directly with us, please connect with CANARI and the Climate Conscious Podcast on any of our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and my personal favorite, LinkedIn. See show notes for direct links to our websites. The Better Than Before series is a production of the Climate Conscious Podcast in collaboration with CANARI, funded by the Open Society Foundations. This series is edited and produced by Bradford Media. with artwork by Carrie Lee Dixon. Join us on the next episode.